So it's great to have Professor Milanovic here to kick off our series and talking about recent trends in global income distribution and their political implications. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for coming. I actually feel obviously delighted and very honored that actually so many people have come. So I hope that you're not going to leave the room disappointed, so I have to make it, I hope somewhat entertaining. This is obviously such a huge topic. Inequality has become a huge topic. And what I will talk about today, and actually I asked Tom to stop me after about 35 minutes, because I would like to really wrap up after 40, because it's hard to listen to anybody for more than 40 minutes, I think. And I really would like to have more interaction, because I'm sure you have lots of questions to ask. And really, if you have clarifying questions, to ask me during the presentation. So I will be talking today about one subset of inequality topics, and that's about global inequality. Now, I know that many of you are maybe sort of came here also partly because of enormous success of Piketty's book, but it deals with different topics. Actually, it's obviously inequality, but it's inequality within individual countries. That was actually, the topic of Capitalism in the 21st Century, and also earlier work by Piketty. And even the database is very different. So I just wanted to mention that because there is sometimes lack of clarity in that. Of course, as you know, Piketty says Atkinson, Facundo Alvaredo, and others, and more recently Gabriel Zachman, work with fiscal data. So these are data in the case of the US from IRS. This is a sample of, obviously they don't have 150 million whatever filers, but obviously a sample, large sample. So they of course focus, as you know, on the top 1%, because that sample, however large it is, does not cover the entire population, because you have about 7% of Americans who don't file tax returns, and of course in many other countries, poorer countries like India, you have the opposite situation. You have 2% of people who file tax returns and 98 who don't. It's not like a bad sign, it's just simply that at very low levels of income, you don't have the first, many people would not go above threshold, and actually a sign of development is the ability of having personal income tax system where actually you are self-assessing, you're assessing yourself. So I'm using, and I will be using today, an entirely different database. It was household surveys. It is household surveys, as I will not have time to talk about them a lot because it's a subject on its own, but it's actually, only made possible essentially by the late 1980s, because by that time you had household surveys in most of Africa, largely thanks to the World Bank. Not that the World Bank was doing the survey itself, but as actually the funding or helping the countries administratively, do the surveys. Then China had the big interruption during the Cultural Revolution, and the first new survey started in 1982. And finally the Soviet Union, which actually had a surveys going back all the way to 1920s, which is actually one of the big unfortunate events after the transition, that they remained absolutely, utterly unresearched and destroyed, actually started supplying the data only after 1988. So basically you had this confluence of these events which have to do with surveys, and at the same time, of course, you had globalization, and that was really the beginning of our ability to do global income distribution using actual data and surveys from 100+ countries in the world. Now, in my relatively recent paper with Christoph Lackner, we actually create panels. I will talk a little bit about that today here, but I will talk about other things as well. But we have created panels now. It's actually available on the internet, where you basically have 120 countries approximately with deciles, although I will be using here for more recent data percentiles. So with deciles from 1988 at 5-year intervals up to 2008 and now 2011. So what it means essentially is that you can actually then compare. I think it's a big step forward. You can compare like the trajectory of the second urban decile in China with, let's suppose, and all expressed in the same PPP, same currency, PPP dollars, with, for example, I don't know, 6th decile in the US, or seventh decile in Tanzania, or something like that. So basically, that's actually, I think, big step forward, much more recent than my other work, which actually goes back to the, previous millennium, actually. So that was the second difference. The third difference, also important to mention, is that I will be talking today entirely about disposable income, which means it's an income after you have received social transfers and deducted direct taxation. So I think it's actually the best indicator, obviously, of welfare. I would be using also consumption in some cases, because unfortunately there is no sort of unification at the global level. Some countries like India have essentially consumption surveys, whereas others like the US, Western Europe, Russia, Brazil have income surveys. So that's a big issue. But I want to mention that I'm talking about disposable income. Third difference between what you will see here and what Piketty and the co-authors have is that they actually talk about market income, which is income prior to redistribution, which is prior to social transfers and prior to direct taxation. I think many people always want to emphasize that, because many people don't sort of know that and find it kind of interesting that direct taxation is not deducted in the income data that Piketty and co-authors have. Now, what I understand is actually they are working on deducting it now, but in the current work it has not been done. So these are really the differences, methodological and definitional. And it is only because of the developments, as I said before, in household surveys that we are able to actually derive, or not only to guess, but really to derive world income distribution. Now, why is it important? I would leave that for the end, but I would actually, what I want to start with is that basically decompose global inequality into two components. And you will see actually they're really crucial. And the first component is inequalities within nations, which is an obvious component, like you say, okay, what happened to inequality in the United States, in China, in Brazil. And the second component is inequality in average incomes between nations. So I can call it country gaps, if you will. So that would be inequality, which would be, difference in mean incomes between US and Mexico, US and Canada, and then each of these bilateral comparisons, and then of course you take Spain versus Morocco, Spain versus Germany, and so on. So these are really two different things. And to realize how different they are, the first one is really something that we all kind of think about, because we are generally plugged into our own country's inequality. We don't think very much about global inequality. The second one is really something which is underlying, in my opinion, all the migration movements, issues of global inequality, opportunity, and all of these things. This is really the means. And it's only when you combine the two that you actually get to the global inequality. Moreover, and I'm not going to belabor that point, but moreover, they respond to two different things. The first one, when you talk about within national inequalities, you might have in view some theories of movement of within national inequalities. Maybe Kuznets, maybe Piketty's R greater than G, maybe Pareto. But when you come to the second one, when you talk about differences in mean country incomes, you really move to theory of growth, essentially. So there, the key concept is convergence. So it is really in the combination of the two concepts. On the one hand, theories of income distribution, which are derived for nation state, and on the other hand, theory of growth, which is derived, or actually sort of applied, to the difference in countries' mean incomes that we find global inequality. And this is why I think it's a very rich topic, because it really combines really two important strengths in economics, growth and distribution. So after that long, lengthy introduction, let me just go very quickly over some of these preliminaries. So let's see what happened to within national inequalities. And you know that, so I will be very quick on this, and I'm not going to read the graphs. I guess, people can, multitask. We can multitask about 5 different things at the same time, so you can listen and read, I'm sure, and probably do your iPhone and tell other people what I'm saying, and maybe check what is for dinner all at the same time. So I will not need to read them all out. And this is something which is generally known, that basically Gini's which is a measure of inequality, we are talking about nation states now only, has gone up in the last 25 to 30 years. Of course, the US is a prime example of that. We know all of that the trough of inequality was in the 1979, 1980, then gradually increased, but it's now more or less stable, but much higher level than it was in the 70s or the 80s. But the same is true for UK, for Sweden. People kind of forget about that, but Sweden had that significant increase in disposable income inequality. Even for Germany, and then of course for China in a big way, for Russia in a big way, in Ukraine. So essentially, India as well, but not as large. So essentially, all the world has seen that. So let me show you that on a graph where actually I have this Gini's here on the horizontal axis in 1988, and then 2008. I mean, it's a long story, but I was a little bit lazy. I should have actually had 2011, but there are some issues there. But basically, we have to date up to 2011. And what you can see is actually if you're above the 45-degree line, then you have had an increase in the Gini coefficient. China comes, that's kind of a peculiarity of China and India. I use them with China rural and China urban. The key reason is that China actually fields two different surveys. One is urban and another is rural. And the size of the dots really represents population in the country. So as you can see, actually large countries, really populous countries, generally had an increase in inequality. The interesting part, and maybe later in the discussion somebody can ask about that, the interesting part is here. Again, it's well known, you read it in the papers. Brazil had a very significant decline in inequality. And we are not talking now about 2 or 3 years where you can never be sure if it's really a real one or maybe it's a data issue. But really we are talking about more than a decade, of a decline, consistent decline in inequality. Now, of course, as you notice, it actually starts and it's still an extremely high level of inequality, Gini of 60. So we should not be, as I tell my students, always a delta society. We just look at change. Obviously, that's a good thing that Brazil has had this change towards lower inequality. But we should not forget that Brazil's inequality is extremely high still. And it's actually significantly higher than the US inequality, let alone other OECD countries. So that was actually, Latin America, Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina are in that sense back in the trend, which has been generally for the increase in inequality. Now this is simply I might actually have to gradually start skipping some of the slides because there are too many of them. But this is simply a slide which illustrates, this is kind of a semblance of the Kuznets curve here, which links, this is mean per capita income from household surveys, which is kind of similar to GDP per capita, except that they use, the mean income that you generate from household surveys. And then here's the Gini coefficient, and I highlight these are the rich countries, the old, so-called old OECD. And you see actually how within the OECD countries, US is indeed kind of an outlier within OECD countries. US, Israel, and UK, which is here. Because as you see, others are more around there. But then on the other hand, when you compare US with the rest of the world, it is not. Actually, US is in kind of with a Gini coefficient on the world average, which is now, if you take all the Ginis from all the countries in the world, you get something like an average or a median, maybe Gini would be around 40. And that's where the US is. Now, the green ones, I don't need to discuss that a lot. That's Latin America, so obviously it's quite high. There is it was actually one of the vignettes that in my book, The Haves and the Have-Nots, that Tom kindly mentioned. I had this following experiment. Imagine like European countries, and then you have all their Ginis, and then UK is pretty unequal within Europe, okay? So it's really extreme, kind of, with Portugal, very high inequality. So assume that UK suddenly becomes the 51st state of the United States, and take US state Ginis, which actually are not, they're different, but they're relatively compact, they're all relatively high. And then UK would be relatively equal among US states, although it is the most unequal country, probably the most unequal country in Western Europe. But then continue with that experiment going to Latin America. Now compare Latin American countries to US states. And actually all of them would be more unequal than any US state. So that's basically what we had, and I think this is kind of illustrated there. Of course, countries in Africa, like South Africa, Botswana, Namibia are very, very unequal. There were some issues about Namibia numbers. They even wrote to me at the time wrongly, sort of, bad mouthing Namibia. It is true, actually. They have lower numbers now, but they don't want to release microdata. And this is all based on microdata. So it's not kind of invented numbers. It's actually what you get from household surveys. And calculate yourself, so you have to see these numbers. And then this is the transition countries, which, as you can see, span really large, in terms of mean income, they're really from poor countries like Kyrgyzstan to Slovenia, really large span, but they are not actually, with exceptions, as I say, Georgia, Russia, Ukraine, they're not really extremely unequal. There was an increase in inequality, but many of these countries are below OECD average still. So anyway, so this is the last point there within national inequalities, and I really have to move, is that this is a nice graph based on Luxembourg income study data, which, as you know, kind of is the only data source which unifies microdata. So in other words, we take household surveys from, not that many countries. We have, I think, 41 or 42 countries, and then you essentially try to, how should I say, to harmonize the definitions of the variables. So it's a very powerful tool because normally it's very hard to compare if you go at anything below income level, overall income. If you want to compare, for example, social transfers on wages between Brazil, US, and UK, it's very hard to do that. But with less you can do that because the variables are unified. Now, this is actually an interesting slide because it shows you the following thing. This is the market income, which is income before, as I said before, before government redistribution via social transfers and taxes. Now look at that. It starts from the US from 1969, and it has been on the increase throughout. And of course, the Gini is about 50. That's of course much higher than the disposable income Gini, which is the blue line, because what happens is that you reduce the market Gini, you reduce through social transfers to get to the green point, and then through direct taxation to get to the blue point. And as you can see in the US, what is interesting is that market income inequality has gone up, redistribution has remained broadly the same, and then, of course, disposable income more or less follows, inequality in disposable income follows the inequality in market income. I took Germany here as a nice example, is that you have the same increase, or actually more dramatic increase in market income, which is an interesting topic for students who want to do PhD dissertations and stuff. I really point this out. We have really an interesting fact, which has not been really much studied, is that in all developed countries, you have had really significant increase in market income inequality. And that's, of course, captured by Piketty, because as I said before, his data are market income, but come from fiscal side. But we see the same thing here for household surveys. It's interesting. So there must be forces, globalization, technological change, policy, which really drive the pre-distribution inequality up. Now, of course, you can fight the increase in pre-distribution inequality by increasing redistribution. And actually, to some extent, you see that happening in Germany, to some extent, because then the reduction in inequality due to the social transfers, which is here, this is the reduction, and then to taxation, which apparently has not changed very much, has been relatively large, so that you have still an increase in the blue line, but that increase is much less steep than the increase in the red line. So what I want to point out here is that with microdata of this kind, you can actually at least make two conclusions here. Is that we have, in most rich countries, we have had significant rise in market income inequality. However, policy, which is reflected in how much you sort of drive it down, policy is not totally, powerless, impotent to do something with it. And if you really want to increase redistribution, you can check this increase in market income inequality, or you might even maybe exacerbate it or just leave it unchanged. But I think it's, as I said, an interesting topic to study in its own. So now let me go, I will have to skip all this longer. This is actually an interesting graph for the US. This is based on household survey data from 1929. We're actually the first, it was National Bureau of Economic Research, some kind of modern service existed. Obviously, we don't have the individual data for many years, but this is basically the graph, very similar to the graphs that you have seen in PKT, which actually take a look at the top 1%. And I think that's one of the, I think arguments that there is no doubt, I think, that actually that there was a significant increase in the US inequality because two very separate data sources and two very different definitions of income to come to broadly the same conclusion of this U-shaped, movement in US inequality. Okay, so the other things I have really to skip because there are like too many of them. And there will be like other slides that I have to skip because we will otherwise never come to the global inequality. Now, the second part of global inequality, as I said, is between national inequality. So these are inequalities between mean country incomes as you obtain them from household surveys, or if you want to think of them differently, although I would not encourage you for methodological reasons, which are too long maybe to explain now, but I will be happy to explain later, think of GDP per capita if you really, because obviously many people, very few people have data from household surveys around the world. So these inequalities have remained very large, and I will give away the story a little bit. If you take the whole global inequality as, let's suppose, 100, about, depending on whether you use the tail index or Gini, but essentially upwards of 2/3 of global inequality is explained by the differences in mean country incomes. So essentially, this is really the big story. Is actually the global inequality is essentially explained by the differences between individuals who live in the US and Mexico, in Spain versus Morocco and so on. However, the caveat there is that the peak probably of that between country inequality was reached in the 80s, maybe early 90s, and now, particularly now in the last 10 years, because of the slowdown and recession in the West, which is the rich part of the world, and continued growth, particularly of China and India, but also Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and so on, that these between-country differences are being eroded. So that's actually a very good news because, as you will see later, this is really the major force behind, first, the check on global inequality, and more recently, probably slight decline in global inequality. So it is really the two things are really important there in advance, just to say, between country gaps are still the dominant force in explaining global inequality, and I will illustrate it in a second. But that dominant force is becoming gradually less dominant thanks to this, rebalancing of the world essentially between the West and Asia. So if you really want to extend this, and if you argue or think that in the next 50 years Asia is going to continue growing at 4 or 5% per year, and the rich world is going to go into a stagnation, then you essentially might see in 2070 or maybe 2100, you would have a situation where the between-country gaps would have really shrunk significantly, but maybe within national inequalities would have increased or remained very high. We don't know. So what I want to say is that actually the composition of global inequality changes, and actually sometimes over obviously long period can change pretty dramatically. In my forthcoming book, which actually will come out next April, it's called Global Inequality. Very simple. I actually, the chapter which deals with that, and I think that would evocate very clearly what I have in mind, is called From Karl Marx to Frantz Fanon and back to Karl Marx. Because that's essentially the change in the underlying forces in global inequality over the last 2 centuries. Because when Marx was writing Das Kapital, we of course have some guesses there, but basically the dominant force behind global inequality was within national. So let me then illustrate these large within national differences using one of my favorite graphs. And this graph is the following. It actually here shows you your position in your country's income distribution. So there are obviously people who are very poor Americans, they will be in the first, second percentile, and then as you go further, they're actually obviously in higher percentiles. And then you actually plot them against the global income distribution. In other words, you ask the following question. Let me take a guy with a median income in the US, which would be here, and let's find where is he in the global income distribution. As you can see, he or she would be something like 95th percentile in the world. Because obviously the US is a rich country, and even very poor people are above the median. And this would be even more dramatic with, like, for example, countries like Denmark that would actually go from the 80th percentile, to the 100th. And also you see here that 12% of the richest Americans are part of the global top 1%. So that also raises lots of questions about who is really top 1%. Is it really national top 1%? Is it global? How do you define it? But of course, the striking thing of this graph is when you take countries like India, which is actually underestimated here. So before I acknowledge that, and I can explain why. But even if it was not underestimated, it would still show that, of course, poorest Indians are really amongst poorest people in the world. The bottom 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 percentiles. And richest Indians, on average, that's important. That's about 12 million people in that percentile. So it doesn't mean that there are no people who are actually top percent. Obviously, I'm not talking about billionaires because they're not in the service, whether in the US or India or any other country. But of course, you have lots of Indians who are very well off and who would be in there, but not in a sufficient number that the average income of 12 million would bring them to the top 1% level. So that you can see actually a huge gap, and you can see that actually the poorest Americans are very basically at the level of the 80th percentile on India. As I said, even if I actually were to, there are reasons why Indian data are underestimated, but even if you add like 5 points to each data point in India, it would come still to basically the same conclusion, is that actually poor Americans are well off by global standards, and the middle class in India is poor by American standards. And then you get other countries. This is China, which of course dominates India at every point of the distribution, which is not surprising, and it's actually even higher now over here. But you see actually, still the presence of many Chinese who are really at the bottom of the global income distribution. The next one is Russia, which dominates China at every point. But what is interesting, and I don't have it here, but I have another slide, what you see in Russia here is practically identical to China urban. So if I take China and divide it in China urban and rural, I have for the urban China actually slightly above Russia. So I really have China now here, China urban. Now that pushes rural much lower. So essentially we really have in the case of China two countries, as it were. If you take the data as they are, which is of course a big issue in China, but taking them as they are produced and published, we really have essentially two countries. One, as I said, which is now over here. Chinese mean income in the urban areas from the household surveys is now higher than the mean or the median income in several poorer EU members. So this is actually a historical change. I cannot emphasize it enough, that actually China is now, so to speak, entering the European Union. In other words, Chinese incomes have reached the level, or gone a little bit above the level of the poorest EU members in the urban areas. I'm talking about urban areas of China. So it's really a great change, particularly for some of us who remember where China was in 1980 and where it is today. And then finally, my people always like this country for many reasons, but it's a country obviously that attracts lots of attention also because it spans the entire world income distribution with, of course, many people who are poor, but then, sizable middle class, and then also people who are in the top global 1%. And of course, it really basically mimics the world. And I could have taken South Africa as another example. You have actually countries that essentially, the world is more unequal than Brazil overall. But Brazil comes close to the world, obviously much closer than any other country here. So why is this graph, I think, important is because really it illustrates, I think, very nicely the importance of these differences in between country incomes, and then of course leads you to the issues which I will not have the time to speak today, but it's in my book, political economy issues, political philosophy issues. The issues of obviously first migration, but then the issue of distributive justice at the global level, the question of global inequality of opportunity, because if you explain 60% of everybody's income by the place of residence, which is for exception of 3% of the whole population, the same as the place of birth, then you really have an issue to deal with. You might think actually it should not be dealt with, but it's also a possibility. Rawls was against it. Is the issue of global inequality of opportunity. In other words, when we speak of inequality of opportunity, we always implicitly think of the nation state. But really, we can extend that case or consideration to the world as a whole, and that's actually obviously a very big attribute that enables you to have a much higher income stream if you were born in a rich country or in a poor country. So as I said, it leads to many other issues. So for example, here is the description, the same graph, but with Denmark and African countries, and then basically you don't have here an overlap. So in other words, practically in statistical sense, everybody in Denmark is better off than anybody in African countries. Again, doesn't mean that there are not people in Tanzania who are better off than poor people in Denmark, but they are not there in statistically significant numbers. That graph can be used for many things. Here is actually basically the same story, where it actually illustrates the fact that 12% of Americans, as I mentioned before, are in the global top 1%, and then you have countries like, this Che is not Che Guevara, but it's actually Switzerland. You have, 9% of the Swiss and 9% of people from Singapore and so forth. So this is for the. So let me now come to putting these two things together. By the time that I'm actually, I think, running out of myself. Yes, actually, I have now to put these two things together, very kind of briefly, because I would like to open the floor for discussion. And so it's basically how did global inequality change first over the last 60 years, and then the last slide that I want to show is the slide which many people have liked, found it, very useful, and that's about the changes in global inequality over the last 25 years. Now, when you really think of global inequality, it was somewhat implicit in what I was saying before, is that you really have to think intuitively. Intuition is the following. Think what happens first to within-country income distributions. Everything else being the same, if countries are becoming more unequal within themselves, it should push global inequality up. That's kind of a, commonsensical. Then, think of the second thing. Is there a divergence or convergence of incomes? And there, I think the most useful thing is to think of Africa, because here we are talking about unweighted convergence, right? Simply countries, without population weights. And there, really, the issue is Africa catching up with the rich world. And, for most of the period between 1980 and 2000, that was not the case, because Africa had a pretty bad period, and the rich world had a reasonably good period. And then, however, it is actually the case over the last 10 years, because African growth rates have been generally higher than the growth rates in the rich world. So if you have this catching up, then obviously that should reduce global inequality. But the third element, as I was already saying before, is the most important. And that's actually where the population weighting comes in. You ask the following question. Are China and India essentially catching up with the US? I call this in the previous book, The Worlds Apart, and now I call it the triangle. And this relationship, China, India, US, is absolutely crucial because it explains about like 40% of what happens to global inequality. Other countries are clearly play a role, and Africa will gradually play a bigger and bigger role as its population goes up. But in the last 50 years, it is really the triangle which was the most important. Now I have to just very briefly say one thing which I think is important. People kind of don't see it very well. China has been a crucial force for dampening or stopping the increase in global inequality, and more recently reversing it. So if I really take China out, and I have, I think, some graphs here. Okay, well, I'll show you that later. This is actually a movement of global inequality based on over these 2 centuries, based on this is Bourguignon-Morisson data series, and this is more recent. And you see this actually decline over here, which is quite significant. It's basically you have an increase, which these are different PPPs. That's why the problem you cannot. I mean, you could technically, but I really didn't want to do that because they're really 2 different PPPs. And then you essentially say that the peak was reached around here, probably, and then basically after that we have leveling off of global inequality and a decline. The decline is, you know, quite significant over the last 10 years. And then, as I said, China was really the main force to prevent an increase, and then more recently China and India, as I call them, like are these two big sumo wrestlers who are fighting global inequality down. However, there is one thing which is interesting to keep in mind. As China becomes richer, it would gradually, and actually in the Gini coefficient decomposition, it already is now at a point where it would start adding to inequality. Because as China becomes richer and becomes further apart from other large countries, like Nigeria, Sudan, Vietnam, Burma, and others that are growing slower, China becomes a contributor. I think within the next 5 or 10 years it will become a contributor to global inequality rather than a deductor of global inequality. So it's a very interesting situation that, that the country that we actually celebrate rightly for actually contributing to the reduction of global inequality, despite the fact that within itself it has had huge increase in inequality, might, because of its own success, as it were, turn into a factor of increased global inequality. So that's an interesting, I think, thing to reflect, because when you do these projections, you actually find this, that actually China becomes a disequalizing force if it keeps on growing at, 6 or 7% per year. So my last slide that I actually wanted to, well, these are really myriad of technical issues, so I will have to skip them all. I'm sure you would ask me about PPPs, so I'm not, and you will ask me also about the top 1%, so I'm leaving this intentionally out, because I'm sure these things always come. My final slide is actually, this is based on a paper with Christoph Lackner, is this one, which I think really very dramatically and very, I think, interestingly illustrates what we all knew happened in the world in the last 25 years, but we didn't have the numbers to show it. And I still remember in June 2012, where I actually first calculated these numbers and first time saw this graph, I knew that it was actually something, I'm not saying dramatic, but I said, well, I knew it all along. I'll explain the graph in a second, but you never had the numbers to show it. Now, what does the graph show? Is that you take percentile of global income distribution from obviously 1 to 100. Obviously, for those people, they would ask me which percent, is it in the beginning of the period 1988 or just anonymously? This is anonymous in this here. Is it basically you take at every percentile, you take income level in 88 and income level in 2008. And you see what was the change in that real income. All PPP adjusted, inflation adjusted, whatever. So it's all comparable between countries and within countries over time. And then you actually plot here what was the real income change, increase over the 20-year period, expressed again, as I said, in PPP dollars, in percentages actually. And then what we of course see is that the largest increase in percentage-wise was around the median of the global income distribution, where actually people are still very poor. There are people about $5 per day on per capita basis, but they actually had a doubling of they saw a doubling of their real incomes. So this is what I call the point A, and then for simplicity I call it the China's middle class, although it is really lower level than China's middle class, and it doesn't include only China, but 90% of people in that group are from Asia. So basically it's the Asian quote-unquote middle class. So they actually, that's point A. They actually had, of course, large increases, doubling of real income. Then point B here, as you can see, are people over here who actually had very low increase in real incomes. But as you can see, they're actually obviously much better off than people here, because they're at the 80th percentile of the global income distribution, whereas these people here, this is a large group of people between the 45th and 65th percentile. So it's actually really, whatever it is, actually, 1.5 billion people there. But these guys, of course, are better off, but they saw almost no growth. Now, I call it, for simplicity, US lower middle class, but I could have called it because 72% of people there are from the rich OECD countries. And the three countries stand out because of their size. It's the US, Japan with almost no growth there, and Germany. People don't know that, but Germany really had in the media almost no growth. Real wages actually were stagnant in Germany for 20 years. So Germany is also part of that group. So that's my point being. And then the last point is that actually people who were at the, at the top 1%, which is, this is global top 1%, they actually had, of course, a very good period, were also almost doubling of real incomes. So these 3 points, and this is my own last point, is illustrate, I think, the 3 political issues that, that the world, or we, actually as a world, will have to face, I believe, in the next, period of maybe 20 or 30 years. I think the first one is this one here, is the question of accommodation of aspirations of the Chinese middle class for greater participation, maybe different structure of governance or reduction of corruption. I don't want to use democracy, but that's basically also another word that you can use. And I think that's really big, would be a political issue, because income has gone relatively high and maybe ahead of the political system. Now the second political issue is here, because if you believe, and I think there may be some grounds to believe that these 2 points are linked. In other words, that globalization has enabled growth of the middle classes in the poor countries, but has prevented the growth of real incomes in the rich countries. And if you believe that that situation will continue, because after China you will have many other countries that are much poorer than China which can follow, starting with Ethiopia today to India, then you ask yourself the following question. How would democratic system in countries like the US and Western Europe respond to the challenges of having like 50% of your population with zero income growth for 50 years? It's not easy, and that's something really totally new, because the period from 45 to 85, or maybe all the way to the crisis, has been a period of more or less constant growth of, not exactly shared after 1980s, but it was a growth certainly up to 1980s, which was evenly shared, and actually even was stronger among the poorer segments than among the richer segments. But I think it's a big issue, and I think that's where issues of populism versus plutocracy versus democracy come into the focus. And now the last point is here, if the world is creating a sort of a plutocratic global top 1%, of course, clearly many people are rich and very divorced or have nothing to do really with the countries where they come from. It raises really many other interesting issues. I mean, I've just mentioned one because actually it struck me when I worked many years ago on Russia. There was like all the time this sort of a mantra saying, oh yes, well, doesn't matter really how you privatize, because once you privatize, we have seen this in the US, you have robber barons, but they ask for protection of property rights, so it doesn't matter, all these guys will have an incentive to have property rights. Well, it was very clear to anybody who worked in Russia that it's not going to work out like that. Because for them, why should you fight for property rights in Russia when you could just get all this money and go to London or New York, where you do have property rights already guaranteed? So it's a waste of your time to fight it in Russia. And it is actually, I think, what is illustrated by this growth of the global top 1%, of which, of course, I see quite a lot of that in New York. Of course, it's not only global top 1%, it's even much more, obviously, limited group. But it's really, the issue is what will be the world governance, what is their role in the world, and how are they related to the countries where they live in. Or maybe, actually, there's another paper that I recently had published. You can actually argue that they're totally uninterested in their own countries, which are actually, I'll finish there, which is also not totally bad thing, because you can say it's the beginning of some cosmopolitan attitude where you really don't care about your country, you just care maybe about the world. But it's also the situation where your income is totally divorced from the income of the country. So I think that raises, the third political issue, which is this global plutocracy. So I will actually stop here, and I would
So, questions?
Yes, So during your talk, you seem to be running on the assumption that inequality is inherently a bad thing, when in fact a certain amount of inequality is necessary for innovation, entrepreneurship, and risk-taking activities. So my question is, what, in an ideal economy, what is the optimal level of inequality?
Okay, you have asked me actually that whether my implicit assumption is that inequality is a bad thing, and what is the optimal inequality?
Right.
Okay, let me answer this question very quickly, and I'm actually going to take questions one by one, and I will answer them quickly. The first one, I just had an exchange. Some of you might remember him from transition economist Janos Kornai, who was a big Hungarian economist. He made exactly the same point with respect also to Piketty's book and to my own work. I totally disagree. I actually present inequality as purely positive. There is nothing here which I said that implies that inequality is bad. It's just a fact. Now, in people's minds, they think it's bad or good, but that's their problem. It's only when we come to the political philosophy issues that we can actually judge whether it is bad or good. So everything that I presented here is purely facts. Now, the second part is actually what is the optimal, and there I really don't know. Because I think basically one can, to be quite honest, I think one really has to go sort of essentially by looking at what we have recorded in history and seen. And essentially, I think you can start with 2 points, with inequality being 0, or technically very, very small, and we can say, well, that's really very bad for the reasons that you mentioned, lack of incentives for innovation, for work and all that. So clearly it's not very good for growth. Well, then you go to the other extreme where inequality is very, very high, and then you can say, well, it's not very good for growth because it could lead to political instability, it could lead to a sort of broken society, it could lead to actually people who are unequal and poor being left out of the system. It can undermine democracy. It has many other negative, significantly negative features. So you can actually basically, it's a little bit like the Laffer curve. I know, it's basically, you can say, well, it's somewhere in the middle. And then essentially you have heuristically to look at the countries that have functioned well with reasonable levels of inequality. So if you were to ask me what I think, like heuristically, I would say probably something like a Gini of 35. But it's not based on any, I don't think that there is anybody who can tell you any number which makes sense. The question is, and that's my last point there, and I think that's where research is now moving, I'm encouraged by that, is really disentangling inequality into some different components. Let me put it like that. If you have total inequality and you're able to tell how much of the total inequality is due to the innate characteristics or exogenous forces, like your gender, race, parental background, and if most of inequality in your country is explained by that, then it's obviously not a good thing. And actually you can relate that to the growth rate. So I think that actually we should really start thinking about inequality as not a homogeneous thing, but really heterogeneous, for the reasons that you mentioned in the second question.
Sure. Someone back here. You, sir.
Yeah. So obviously, China's middle class, so these people in developing countries that have been doing so much better over the years, it kind of appears that it is somewhat hurting the U.S. middle class. Is there a way to continue helping those developing countries develop a middle class and helping them become better off without making the people of the United States, the lower middle class, worse off at the same time, or is it kind of just inevitable?
This is something, you asked me actually whether there is a relationship between the high growth in poor countries, middle-income countries, middle classes, and low growth of the middle classes in the US. I really, the data do show you that two things happen at the same time. Now, we know that logically we cannot jump to a conclusion that just because they are, simultaneous, that there is a causality between them. I think causality is extremely difficult to sort of tease out. The work, and I have not done this work, but work on wages, US wages and outsourcing, or US wages and import penetration. And even there, the results are not totally clear, but we definitely know that it's I mean, the culprits, quote unquote, are either technological change or globalization, or the third one is policy. So I just leave it to you. I really don't know if these two things, I just see them at the same time. And I would personally tend to believe that globalization is behind it. But if you ask me, can you really prove that to me? Honestly, I cannot. And I think we are left these three explanations, which I, for simplicity, call TOP, T for technological change, O for openness or globalization, and P for policy. And basically, I think that if you believe in the first, technological change, then you would say, well, there is really nothing we can do because we cannot shut it down. If you believe in globalization, then you can say, well, maybe we can rearrange globalization. And if you believe in policy, you definitely can, because it's obviously done by a democratic process, you could do something. But I really, if you ask me, I believe it's globalization, but I cannot prove it.
Do you see any activity or any correlations between the ownership and the movement of gold and inequality?
And the movement of gold.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I really don't know. I actually, ownership, like ownership of gold?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, no, I have not really done that, no.
How realistic do you see the new goal of United Nations that they want by 2030 to eradicate global inequality and
No, poverty, global poverty.
global poverty? How realistic do you see that one?
Again, this is of course about, the question was actually how realistic is the goal of, I think, the newly adopted, sustainable development goals, yes, SDGs. I think poverty is goal number one, reduction or elimination of poverty. I've seen actually work with several people who did like long-term projections. It does look very unlikely. The goal is not really to eliminate it entirely. The goal is to reduce it to 3%. I think it looks from this is not my work, actually I've just seen it from other people, it looks unlikely that that is reachable. But it could be still reduced actually, because the main engine of reduction of global poverty is again Asia, particularly India, of course China as well. And then Africa, where actually with the population increase and there are lots of people, although Asia is still the dominant group. But so I don't know, I'm a little bit skeptical that the objective will be reached. On the other hand, I think it is good to have an objective. At least it is like you're like in a cockpit. At least you know which way you're going. I'm not saying that this objective per se is going to lead you to reduce or eliminate world poverty. But it's useful for you to know, is the world poverty going down or is same or is going up? So I'm in favor of having an objective.
Yeah, if I heard you right, you said that about 2/3 of global income inequality is explained by between countries. I'm wondering how that breaks down if you were, rather than 2 components, you had 3, with the middle level being regional. So within country, within region, and then between region, what would it look like?
The question was actually if the composition was between, within countries, how would it go then? Within, between regions and between, I'm not sure where the regions, between countries and between regions, something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't thought of that. I don't know. I have to give it a thought. I'm not sure how the composition would exactly work because the genie or tail are decomposable always. You can redefine things. You can define actually like Europe and America and Asia. And then you do inequality within Europe, within Asia, and so on. But I'm not sure, like with 3, if it's doable. But I haven't thought of that. But that decomposition is very interesting because you can decompose, for example, inequality in China between provinces. And then, of course, you see that the provincial inequality in China has been on the rise. For the same reason, similarly, if you decompose U.S. inequality within states and between states, you see very strong convergence in mean state incomes, going back to 1950. So U.S. has converged although inequalities within each state have remained or actually increased even. But some other countries like China have diverged. So that's actually not a very satisfactory answer, but that's the answer.
Methodological question, which you teased. So how did you get the income data out of the Indian consumption data?
Okay, very good question. The question was actually how do you move from consumption to income data? And the answer is really you don't do anything. It's basically you treat consumption as income. I'm totally aware that it's an unsatisfactory state of affairs. There is recently work by Sanjay Reddy and Arjun Jayalan trying to sort of establish from the countries where we have consumption and income data some kind of pattern that if you observe that the bottom decile of consumption has, let's suppose, 3% of consumption, then you might expect 5% in income, or maybe less actually. You would expect 2% in income. But mind you, these are of course not the same people at all, because the bottom decile in consumption is different people from bottom decile in income. So unfortunately, like in work on poverty that you mentioned, the two are treated really interchangeably, which really imparts a downward bias to, I think, the income distribution numbers. I'm going to quote you because I think that you have been the home of the first.
You go and then you go.
So, since you're seeing this convergence of countries, are you inferring that the disparities are largely derived from intra-country income distribution gap?
Well, let me, I think, see if I can find it towards the end. But anyway, let me explain to you. If you take the global inequality as 100, okay? As I said before, 2/3 or 70% or even 75%, depending on the measure, is really due to the differences between mean differences in mean incomes between countries. Very clear. Which has an implication that if you really have to sort of decide, let's suppose technically, and then you have work on some trade-offs, should really most of the attention be directed to reducing within national inequality or speeding up the growth of poor countries? It's very clear that the second is more potent tool to reducing global inequality. But that 2/3 or 70% is now shrinking, driven by growth in Asia. So it could be that actually in 20 or 30 or 50 years, it becomes a smaller component than within national inequality. So, you know, that was what I said from Marx to Franz Fanon to Marx, is that because in the early 19th century, if you take still this global inequality as 100, most of that was due to within national inequalities. The country gaps were small. You know, it was 3-to-1 between the top and the bottom, 4-to-1 maximum. But now, of course, top and bottom is more than 100-to-1. And then it went up and up and up with the Industrial Revolution, with the continuation of growth, or absence of growth, particularly in India and China. And then it kind of reached the peak, probably, we don't know exactly, but around 1980, let's say. And then it stayed there, I think actually it stayed there all the way to 2000, and then is now being reduced. Now, it's not given that it will continue being reduced. You can have revolution in China, and China growing at -10%, and this will be all sort of stopped. But if we sort of think that it's not going to be stopped, we can see this maybe gigantic U-turn, where actually global inequality would be reduced, and the components would change. That within national inequality might become more important than between them.
Thank you for a very exciting presentation, and also I look forward to the forthcoming book on Marx. I myself work on gender inequalities, which are of course also multidimensional even in the economic sphere, and the relation between those and macroeconomic policies and vice versa. Inequalities of macroeconomic performance and the back news. And you mentioned that in your new work you were going to look at sort of decomposing inequalities by, for income. So when I look at sort of income distribution figures, even though these are always measured at a household level, because this guy is a deeper level of inequality within households, but also within markets in terms of wages and so on, and within states, policies of the state, right, in terms of who gets the resources, transfers, and so on. Are you doing your work of decomposition in terms of taking this sort of global inequality and trying to figure out, for example, like the U.S. lower middle class person is, let's say, sitting here and has had real income in percent in this way, you know, in the last whatever 10 years, 20 years, and then is it possible to break this particular figure, for example, to break it down by gender? I mean, in some cases you might have the gender disaggregated data, in some countries you probably don't. But
Okay. So the question was actually how the global income distribution data actually account for gender. No, the answer is going to be very quick. They don't. And this is another methodological issue. The thing is that when you have household surveys, you have data on income within household. You have data on who contributed back. I mean, if you're lucky, you have data who contributed what. But when you work on global inequality or on poverty, you just take that income of the household divided by n number of members, and you make implicit assumption that it was equally shared. You have no grounds to make any assumption whether really somebody gets more or somebody else gets less. So basically, the gender aspect, which is really an aspect basically ingrained in household, is left out. So that's not really included at all. Technically, you could actually do, but that's very very difficult work. Technically, you can focus, and there are small groups of female single-headed households. But they are not going to give you much because these groups are small in countries. So there is not much there. However, actually, on that same topic, I would just want to point out that the tax data are better, and there is currently work that Tony Atkinson is doing with, I can't remember the name of the person, on that, looking at the top 1%, because tax data are data, well, they are tax units, of course, but the tax units you can actually find out, what is the percentage of women in the tax units which are in the top 1%. So they're actually doing some work on that, which I think is quite promising, but that's the fiscal data. The household survey data you can do nothing.
Any questions?
Someone else, I'll go with another methodological
Yeah.
question, which is sort of key. I noticed you used at least 2 or maybe 3 different PPP measures.
Yeah.
Would you mind expanding on that?
Well, this is, of course, the question was about uses of different PPPs. Now, this is really a big topic. Okay, for example, when I showed this graph about global inequality from 1820 to today, the data up to 1992, and they're really guesswork essentially. It's based on Bourguignon-Morrison's work, which uses Madison's GDP per capita, because there are no surveys from 1820 or whatever. Although there is some work on that, but almost no. And they're using GDP per capita that Madison produced, which is in 1990 PPPs. So that's why it goes like this. Okay. Then, when I use like 2 different PPPs, because all my work previous to the more recent PPPs, 2011, were conducted in 2005 PPPs. Now, the 2005 PPPs differ significantly, particularly when it comes to China and India, from the 1990 PPPs, because Chinese price level in 2005 was assessed very highly, and consequently real incomes of the Chinese were reduced very significantly. It was not even noticed because China has grown so fast that between the time the survey was conducted in 2005 and when it was published in 2008, China has grown up to compensate for that decline, which was statistical decline. So when you use 2005 PPPs, global inequality is pushed up because China and India as well have really, and actually all of Asia, have sort of been shown to have higher price levels and consequently low incomes. 2011, we are back to somewhere in between 1993 rather and 2005, with now Chinese price level being lower, Indian price level 20% lower, and consequently real incomes increase, and global inequality decline. So that's the situation, unfortunately, with PPPs. And I can go easily between 2005 and 2011 PPPs. There's no problem because I have all the data. But it's very hard to go to undo. You can make guesses, but it's actually very difficult to undo the building block of Bourguignon-Morrison, which is 1990 PPPs used by Angus Madison. Now, there is an Edison project going on right now, which now tries to do all Agnos's numbers in 2011. So when it's done, then you could probably do that and have a consistent series. But I really intentionally, even in my book, and I was actually advised by a referee that I should really put it like in one series. I think it's really not, we can all figure out like by looking the shape, but I think it would be really wrong to pretend that these are the same thing when they're not. And so I prefer to keep it as it is.
If I read your earlier graph correctly, if the bottom 1% of the U.S. income distribution, the poorest 1% of the United States has income roughly equal to the 0.6 decile of the Chinese, or 0.5, whatever it was, do you really think there's a comparison of quality of life between the absolute poorest of the United States and the 0.7, 0.6 of the Chinese? I find that hard to believe.
Okay, the question was actually whether really the income data that we have here reflect quality of life. And I agree with you in some sort of, it's a good question, in some broader or philosophical sense. Certainly if you were to choose, okay, let's suppose it's same income, right? Would you prefer to be in the very bottom of the US income distribution or the 60th percentile of the Chinese? I think that most of us would agree that we are better off with 60th percentile of Chinese because there are probably stigma effects. There are actually the fact that, of course, if you're at the bottom, you're probably unhappy because you see others ahead of you and so on. So I do agree with your point. But, this is my impression. But these are really hard numbers. So again, a little bit similar to the original question about inequality, I really take it as a purely positive statement. And I'm just saying these guys have approximately the same real income if you measure it. And I just read a couple of days ago, for example, if you look at obviously it's about below poverty line, which is like 14% of Americans. But I think there was something like 90% have cars, then 32% have 2 cars. Obviously 99% have electricity. So we are really looking at quote-unquote objective numbers. Now, of course, I know I've seen this, this is not, maybe they're not happy, and I can understand, I would not be happy to be living there either. But, it is my subjective judgment, and I take your point.